If there's one thing the world has learned about Ukraine during its war with Russia, it's that this country is full of surprises. It doesn't play by the usual rules or adhere to expected military standards. Instead, it innovates, it trailblazes, it does things differently, often because it has no other choice. It doesn't have the gigantic military budget or vast resources that Russia has after all. So, it's had to adapt to difficult conditions and tight constraints in order to both survive and succeed in the conflict so far. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Ukrainian Air Force, which is, without doubt, one of the strangest air forces on the planet today. Indeed, while many other major military powers around the world focus on streamlining their air forces and simplifying their fleets, Ukraine has gone in the opposite direction, developing an increasingly diverse and complex aerial branch of its armed forces. No other country is doing this, and on the surface, it may look like a completely crazy decision that defies both logic and reason. Dig a little deeper, however, and this could turn out to be yet another masterstroke by Kyiv's commanders, one that will ultimately make their air force significantly stronger than it's ever been before. In order to understand what makes Ukraine's air force so different, we first have to explore what makes so many of the others so similar. Look at many of the world's air forces and you'll notice a common trend. They tend to operate just one or two main types of fighter jets. France, for example, primarily relies on its 4.5 generation Dassault Rafale and also has a smaller fleet of Dassault Mirage 2000s. Germany's jet fleet, meanwhile, extensively focuses on the Eurofighter Typhoon, supplemented by the Panavia Tornado. The UK also operates the Typhoon, as well as a batch of American Lockheed Martin F-35B Lightnings. It's a similar story across Europe and beyond. The US is a rare exception to the rule, since it has a dramatically bigger military budget than any other nation on Earth, which effectively allows it to operate and maintain a much wider variety of aircraft. Most countries, however, follow the same playbook, and a common objective of many military modernization programs is to streamline Air Force fleets, turning complex and diverse fleets into smaller, simpler ones. There are two big reasons for this: cost and complexity. Even relatively basic combat aircraft still come with expensive price tags, often in the tens of hundreds of millions of dollars per unit. And they don't just cost a lot to make, but also to maintain. There are costs involved in repairing and replacing the many complex mechanical parts and components that make up these miracles of engineering, for example. There are also costs related to logistics, supply chains, and pilot training. The more different types of aircraft a country operates, the more these costs add up and complexities multiply. A force using 3 very different combat aircraft, for example, will need to have unique pilot training programs for each one, along with specific spare parts to keep each jet up and running and ready to deploy as and when it's needed. There are strategic complexities involved with diverse and complex fleets as well. If commanders have a whole host of different aircraft to choose from, they need to continually weigh up the pros and cons of each one to work out which they should use in any given situation. If, however, they have 1 or 2 multi-role aircraft at their disposal, everything becomes simpler, cheaper, and faster. There's also the reason why so many of the latest jets, as well as those that are currently in development, are designed to be as flexible as possible, able to take on multiple workloads and fulfill a wide range of duties. The F-35, for example, is famously regarded as the jack of all trades in the military world, able to seamlessly switch between air-to-air combat operations, ground support missions, and intelligence gathering on demand. This isn't to say that there aren't still some militaries out there that operate a mixture of jets, nor that there aren't any advantages to that approach. Diversifying a fleet can be a smart move in certain circumstances, but on the whole, most major militaries are moving in the same direction, towards simpler, streamlined air forces with fewer jet types than they had in the past. Several NATO members operate just one sort of jet, for example. Then there's Ukraine. And Ukraine does things extremely differently. It doesn't just operate 1 or 2 types of combat jets, it doesn't even operate only 3 or 4. According to the latest data, it's on track to have no fewer than 8 different models of fighter jet designed in 4 different countries. Almost no air force in the world runs such a diverse and complicated fleet, and it's not hard to understand why. Christoph Bergs, aviation analyst with the Royal United Services Institute, explained to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, that most nations avoid such fleets due to a comparative loss of economies in scale and a need to establish comprehensive training, support, and sustainment arrangements for each type of jet. So if nobody else is doing it, Why is Ukraine? Well, to understand that, we first have to rewind and look back at the history of the Ukrainian Air Force thus far. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, Ukraine actually inherited one of the largest fleets of warplanes in the world. Its inventory included around 2,000 aircraft, including the likes of the Tu-160 and Tu-95 strategic bombers, and hundreds of Soviet-era fighters, like the MiG-29, Su-27, and Su-24. This vast fleet gave Ukraine the ability to conduct almost any kind of aerial operations it could have needed, all the way up to nuclear strategic attacks. In 1994, however, Ukraine agreed to the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, agreeing to surrender its nuclear weapons to Russia, which, in return, agreed to respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and borders. As we know now, Russia ultimately refused to keep its side of the bargain, but back in the 1990s, Kyiv had full confidence that Moscow would stick to the deal. So, believing it was safe from any sort of invasion or large-scale attack, Ukraine began dismantling its aerial fleet. As the years passed, it scrapped, sold, or simply transferred hundreds of aircraft, including everything from bombers to jets, trainer aircraft, transport aircraft, tankers, and attack helicopters. These transitions brought millions of dollars into the country, but left its military drastically under-equipped in case a conflict ever broke out. Then in 2014, Ukraine's reality was turned upside down when Russian special forces infiltrated the country and seized control of the Crimean Peninsula. It happened so quickly, Ukraine had little time to muster any sort of reaction. But one fact was painfully clear: the Budapest Memorandum had been broken, and Kyiv could no longer count on the security guarantees that had influenced so many of its military decisions up to that point. Soon after the annexation of Crimea, the Ukrainian Air Force effectively reactivated. Old veterans were brought back into service, teaching and training the next generation of pilots in the art of aerial warfare, while engineers got to work restoring, repairing, and modernizing a few dozen of the mothballed jets like Su-27s and MiG-29s that had been sitting in old military warehouses gathering dust for decades. Ukraine also reached out to allied nations to help it prepare for the possibility of war, with young pilots being sent to the Norwegian Air Force Academy in Trondheim to hone their skills. It wasn't much, but it was something, and Ukraine also began investing in modern air defense systems and drones, realizing that if a war did break out, its aerial force alone wouldn't be anywhere near sufficient to compete with its Russian equivalent. Despite these efforts and improvements, by the time Russian forces marched over the border into Ukraine in February 2022, Kyiv's defense forces had just 120 aircraft at their disposal, and only one-third of them were actually usable, according to then Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny. Russia, meanwhile, had in excess of 4,000 aircraft, plus the funds and means to make hundreds, if not thousands more. It was a complete mismatch, and Ukraine soon realized that if it was to have any chance of surviving the war, then something had to change. But before we explain what happened next, there's more where this came from, so if you're getting value from the military show, don't forget to subscribe. Now, the opening exchanges of the Russia-Ukraine war almost obliterated the Ukrainian Air Force. Indeed, in the very first few hours of the attack on February 24, 2022, Russian forces specifically targeted UAF assets and infrastructure, bombarding numerous airfields, bases, and fuel storage facilities. Fortunately for Ukraine, many of its aircraft were either already in the air at the time or hidden away in other locations, so they managed to survive. Still, the days that followed proved just how much stronger the Russian Air Force was. The Kremlin's pilots were conducting up to 200 sorties a day. Kyiv's pilots, meanwhile, were doing around 5 to 10, as they struggled to make do with their relatively meager fleet made up of 4 Soviet jet types, the MiG-29 and Su-24, Su-25, and Su-27. Ukraine's allies could see that the country's air force was on borrowed time, and they realized it was up to them to do something about it. So, they began looking through their own inventories to identify useful aircraft they could send Kyiv's way. Throughout 2023, for example, various nations across Central and Eastern Europe sent some of their own Soviet-era combat jets to supplement Ukraine's forces. Slovakia and Poland, for instance, transferred some MiG-29s. And while he was grateful for these reinforcements, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky remained hopeful that some of the Western world's major powers would someday provide Kyiv with more modern, advanced, and capable fighters. It took time, but he eventually got what he wanted: In 2024, a first batch of US-built F-16 fighter jets officially touched down on Ukrainian soil, bringing the Ukrainian Air Force's fleet to a grand total of 5 different jet types. The country then had to carry out intensive sessions of pilot training, while also sourcing simulators, spare parts, and support infrastructure before finally rolling its F-16s into operational service. They've since gone on to become highly effective, accounting for around 80% of all Ukrainian sorties and proving immensely useful in terms of countering Russian missiles and drones, as well as executing strikes on ground targets. Various other nations have also contributed additional F-16s to Ukraine in the intervening years. And in 2025, Kyiv's Air Force gained another exciting addition, the Mirage 2000. First flown in 1978, this French fighter has been a mainstay in the French Air Force for decades and has featured in numerous conflicts over the years, from the Gulf War to the war in Afghanistan and the Syrian civil war. Various military forces around the world continue to rely on them, including India, China, and the United Arab Emirates. And the Mirage 2000 has proven popular due to its impressive agility, ability to reach Mach 2 speed, and advanced avionics. Again, it took time for Ukraine to train pilots on how to use this system, but by early 2026, videos were already emerging of Mirage 2000 jets carrying out strike missions on the Eastern Front and dropping bombs on Russian targets. That meant that Ukraine now had 6 different jets overall. But it wasn't stopping there. On June 30, 2026, President Zelensky announced that Ukraine and Sweden had signed an agreement for the purchase of 16 Swedish Gripen E fighter jets, as part of a package that will also include related equipment, technical assistance and support to help Ukrainian pilots and engineers deploy and make use of these aircraft as quickly and efficiently as possible. Now, according to reports, the first 16 of these fighters will arrive in Ukraine in 2029 and 2030. And while the Gripen is a little cheaper and simpler compared to the Mirage 2000 and F-16, it still brings several distinct advantages to the table, like its low operating costs and ability to both take off and land on relatively short runways or highways, which is ideal for Ukraine given that much of the Air Force's pre-existing infrastructure was damaged or destroyed back in 2022. Then, only a couple of weeks after the Gripen announcement, Ukraine unveiled yet another deal. In a joint statement with his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, Zelensky stated that France would soon deliver 4 of a pledged 16 Dassault Rafale fighters to Ukraine. The first batch will arrive once Ukrainian pilots have undergone the necessary training in France, which is set to begin before the end of 2026. By 2028, therefore, or potentially even earlier, the Ukrainian Air Force should operate a grand total of 8 types of combat jets from the Soviet Union, the United States, Sweden, and France. And the crowning jewel of that collection will undoubtedly be the Rafale, which is widely regarded as one of the very best jets in existence today, boasting almost unrivaled versatility, advanced sensor fusion technology, and peerless flexibility, capable of carrying out everything from air defense operations to precision strikes. Very few countries would want such a diverse and complex air force, but Ukraine seems to have embraced it. It didn't necessarily need to accept all these different types of jets, and could instead have negotiated with its Western allies to focus on just 1 or 2 types in larger quantities. Experts and analysts, however, argue that Ukraine has purposefully selected such a complex fleet because of its long-term ambitions to dismantle its old, outdated Soviet fleet and replace it with a fully Western one. As Christoph Bergs explained, Ukraine will be looking to substitute its legacy Soviet-Russian fleet completely with Western aircraft. As such, the comparatively small number of Gripens and Rafales that will be phased in over the next few years will first cover a transitionary, likely accelerated period of training and tactical integration into squadrons. In short, these new jets aren't actually complicating life for Ukraine. They're making it easier for the country's air force to proceed with its transition away from Soviet hardware and towards Western replacement. And that's a transition that simply has to happen. Ukraine cannot continue to rely on decades-old Soviet jets forever. It's not just that these aircraft are older, slower, and weaker than their Western counterparts, it's also becoming increasingly difficult to maintain them as well. Because when Russia seized Crimea in 2014, it severed the supply of spare parts and other crucial resources that the UAF needs to keep its planes in the air. The more time goes by, the fewer Soviet-era parts and materials Kyiv's engineers will have to work with. Eventually, it will reach a point where the old MiGs and Su-25s just aren't airworthy anymore. When that happens, Ukraine wants to be ready. It wants to have a full fleet of Western airplanes ready to take to the air, leaving the old days behind and symbolizing Kyiv's progression into the modern era. And Kyiv can't afford to be choosy or wait around for its Western allies to provide specific sorts of planes in bulk quantities, which is why it happily accepts whatever Europe is willing to send, signing deals and negotiating agreements with France, Sweden, and any other country that wants to lend a hand. This is how Ukraine's jet fleet became such a mishmash. It wasn't an accident, it was by design. The F-16s were first to arrive on the scene since the US and European allies had so many of these jets in reasonable numbers, as well as plenty of spare parts to keep them operational. The Mirages came later, since France was already moving away from that model and focusing more on its Rafales, and Gripens followed up since Sweden already has plenty of them and is eager to assist in defending Europe's eastern flank. Rafales are just the latest and potentially greatest addition to this patchwork force, and the benefits for Kyiv are clear to see. It gets a good amount of modern combat-ready jets as quickly as possible. Its pilots become even more experienced and capable, and its air force also gets to spread the risk, so that even if one of these jet types fails somehow, due to supply cutoff for example, or a political reversal, the rest of the fleet will remain strong. That last part is particularly important. Ukraine is in active conflict, and it cannot run the risk of seeing its entire air force grounded just because a supply chain crashes or an ally elects a new leader who decides they no longer want to help out as much. It needs a force that's active, engaged, and available at all times. Diversity makes that possible. Of course, it comes with caveats. It's notoriously difficult for countries to maintain so many different types of aircraft, and Ukraine has to put time, effort, and money into training its pilots and engineers to use and maintain each new jet before it can be deployed. In the long term, however, it's clear to see that this is a necessary step in the country's military progression, paving the pathway towards a better and brighter future for the UAF, one that will bring it back to post-Soviet glory days and help it not merely beat Russia, but deter any future attacks or invasions on its territory as well. And Ukraine's allies aren't just providing fighter jets, they're also delivering numerous other important assets that are changing the face of this war. Poland, for example, has supplied Ukraine with one of its most valuable armored vehicles, which you can learn all about in this video. Or to see how Ukraine's drone army is getting stronger by the day, check out this video about the new Zirka Interceptor. And finally, make sure to subscribe to the Military Show for more breaking news, insights, and analysis of the Russia-Ukraine war and other conflicts from around the world.